Alright, we are back at it with another video. And today's video is, what would happen if Dio had decided to put the stone mask on George the First? Now, if you're wondering, it's pretty obvious what this timeline is going to be about. It is about the idea that Dio would end up putting the stone mask on George the First in this timeline. Kind of going with the assumption that Dio goes with his original plan of putting it on Jonathan, but then, I guess, failing and doing it on George the First, or alternatively something like, I don't know, something like that. I'll tell you how I would imagine this timeline going as we get into the video itself. So, yeah. But I hope you guys enjoy the video, and we'll go on to see how this alternative universe would play out right about now. But before we get to the video, yeah, I kind of hyped up that we were going to go there, but we didn't. Sorry. I'm going to thank the person who requested this little hypothetical JoJo what if for me to cover. And today, we got to be thanking a special somebody who requested this what if, and that person is Muhammad07. So thanks to Muhammad07 for requesting this JoJo what if. Hope you enjoy this one. Hope everyone enjoys it, but I hope you enjoy it in particular because you request this what if. So, yeah, hope you like it. But let's actually get to the video timeline, shall we? Okay, so now we're going to start off with Phantom Blood. Now in this timeline, for this to work, we're going to have to rewrite a lot of things and a lot of reasons for Dio to want to put the stone mask on Jonathan, or want to go with that intention. Since I'm going with the assumption that Dio never really intended to put the mask on George the First. He was going to put it on Jonathan to get him out of the way. But in this timeline, I'm going to assume Dio decides to go with that intention of going to kill Jonathan, since it makes the most canonical sense. In this timeline, Dio does not, I guess he doesn't put the mask on them. Maybe he still has it, but he decides never to use it on the two guys, which leads to Dio finding out about the stone mask turning people into vampires, etc., etc. In this timeline, let's just assume Dio doesn't use it, or alternatively, maybe Dio still uses it, but maybe he does it in the morning, meaning that when he does it, as soon as its ends, maybe Dio just walks away ASAP, and then the guy just disappears while Dio isn't noticing or something. I don't know. But, I don't know. For the sake of the plot, we're going to say that maybe something happens, or Dio does something to cause him to kill them a different way without using the stone mask. So, yeah, Dio goes with the intention of trying to go with his original plan of putting on Jonathan. This leads to everything kind of going the same, with Jonathan going to the Joestar mansion, Speedwagon obviously there, this cop's there, George the First there. All of that more or less goes the same, but Dio uses this as his way to finally get back at Jonathan and to kill him with the stone mask. But there's a big change. In this timeline, George the First kind of does what he did in the canon by taking the knife wound so Jonathan wouldn't do it. Kind of like how he did in the canon, but instead with the stone mask. So George the First goes in the way, Dio puts the mask on his head, and Dio stabs himself in the hand, getting blood on the mask, and the mask stabs in George the First. This causes everyone to freak out, and George the First, while at it, he turns into a vampire. Maybe in his head he can mutter out something like, "It's pretty ironic how the same thing that ended up starting all this, the same, the whole thing about him finding the mask," he maybe says something about how it's poetic that mask ends up killing him or something. And then George the First, before he can, I guess, fully awaken to his vampire state, he, kicks Dio or something. Maybe Dio's about to get shot by the cops, and in this timeline, I'm just going to assume Dio avoids getting shot because realistically, he'd just get killed. Let's say George first maybe kicks him out of the way, and then this causes George to get shot in his place. Now, in this timeline, I'm just going to assume George first loses humanity off the bat and just starts off as evil. This leads to Dio waking up to a bit, and then Jonathan, Dio, and Speedwagon having to be together. This would definitely cause George first to go on a rampage, realizing that now he's a vampire. Now, it would be hard to rewrite a lot of this because, for starters, George first is going to have to find a way to survive a lot. Because in the case of Dio, he had that prep time and realized how he can survive a lot of this stuff. And I'm just going to assume, for the sake of the plot, Dio is just going to have to do something really crazy to survive this. Now, this timeline could theoretically end with just George first dying, Dio taking the stone mask for himself, and then, I guess, Dio turning himself into a vampire like canon. But that honestly just sounds boring. So let's just go with the assumption that maybe George first is our new main antagonist or our new villain. Which I'd say probably fits better because let's be honest, the fandom hates George the First as much as I'd say a majority of people would hate a villain in a story, so, yeah, he's already treated like a villain to begin with by the fandom, so if anything, it makes a lot of sense. So in this alternative universe, George the First literally is going to try to kill Dio. We'll say he kills the police officers, maybe out of a blind rage because of him losing his humanity. Jonathan helps Dio out because Jonathan still has that noble soul in him, and then Dio and him have to work together to beat George the First. This causes the Joestar Mansion house fire and causes George to be even more hateful toward Dio because Dio had destroyed his house. And then also he's angry at Jonathan, and this just causes George I to overall be pretty much pissed off at the entire Joestar lineage, or like just the brand, or at least Dio in particular. With Jonathan, he's not as insulted by, because in the case of Jonathan, I guess he can understand him, but still he's at least somewhat disappointed that Jonathan picked to help Dio over him. And then this would probably just lead to George running away. Now, as for how George is, I'm going to assume for the sake of the plot, maybe George turns one of his butlers or something into a vampire, and then maybe that's how he finds out about the sun weakness. I don't know, we can find some kind of weak excuse for George I to test the stone mask on something else, causing him to realize the power of the stone mask. George I would become more of a vengeful villain. I don't think he would be pure evil to an extent. I mean, yeah, he generally came off as unlikable. If you remember the first episode of Phantom Blood, a lot of people really didn't like how he treated Jonathan, specifically toward Dio, so if anything, I really don't think that's going to help. But in the case here, I generally think George I would test the stone mask out more and more. Sorry about all the barking if you're hearing that in the background. That is my new dog I recently just got. So she'll be barking a lot. But, yeah, I'm going to try not to get distracted with that, and I'm going to try to carry on with the video. Regarding the rest of the story, Dio would obviously get up with Jonathan and Speedwagon and Arena, and I'm pretty much certain that almost all three of them would hate Dio. No, not almost. I mean, I'm pretty sure two of them would hate Dio, and that's Speedwagon and especially Arena. Now, in the case of Speedwagon, he hates him because Dio did a lot of harm. He basically tried to kill Jonathan's dad, and also tried to kill Jonathan, so Speedwagon doesn't trust him, and also Speedwagon straight up said to Jonathan that Dio was basically pure evil from the start. Meanwhile, Arena would most likely not forgive Dio for, kissing her. Yeah, so I'm pretty much certain they would hate Dio. Dio would probably not want to work with these people, but Jonathan would probably force Dio to do it, because at this point, Dio owes him that. And Dio would probably be like, okay, fine, you saved my life, I guess I owe you this, but I still hate you. But then I think there'd be a part of Dio that we slowly start to see that side of him, that I guess kind of starts becoming more and more human as the part goes on. So in another way, Dio starts becoming more human as the story goes on, becomes nicer, while in the case of George I, he's more or less losing that humanity and just going down a darker path because of what Dio did to him. Obviously, this means that they're going to meet Will Zappelli, Jonathan, Speedwagon, Arena, and Dio, and then Dio's going to get taught Hamon in this universe. So Dio learns Hamon with Jonathan, which I think would be pretty cool. I'm going to assume Dio's just one of the few lucky people who can get Hamon hacks, which I'm just going with that assumption. George I is going to be different from the zombie commander, or not zombie commander, but the zombie from the one Dio episode video where the zombie just kills Dio. That one video I did a couple months back. I think it would be different from the scenario. Honestly, if anything, this kind of just did my What If Dio Turns Good video, but instead of Straito being the main villain, it's George I. So, yeah, I just realized that. But anyway, back to the video. I think for the sake of this plot, I can honestly just see Dio overall being the main, being somewhat of a main, being more of an anti-hero to an extent at the start, but I guess slowly redeeming himself. I do think Dio would be somewhat of a rival character, though. Kind of like a Naruto-Sasuke type of relationship, or Joseph Caesar relationship, Goku-Vegeta-style relationship, where Jonathan and Dio have a rivalry. I think Jonathan would have more of a friendly one, while in the case of Dio, it's more serious to him. So Dio wants to surpass Jonathan with Hamon, while in the case of Jonathan, it motivates him to try to get better. So in a way, Jonathan and Dio would see their rivalry under different circumstances. Dio wants to just be stronger than Jonathan, so learning Hamon is his way of just wanting to be the best. But as the Hanwha training goes on, I like to imagine the idea that Dio would slowly gain that humanity or appreciation of humanity, which is something I would personally write into Dio's character arc in this timeline. Appreciating humanity would be my idea for an arc for this version of Dio. Learning to appreciate life itself and actually care about that kind of stuff instead of trying to ruin everyone and everything's life for selfishness. I could see Dio learning to be more selfless. In the timeline, George I can maybe meet Jack the Ripper and turn him into a vampire. I'm going to assume George I would be evil and would try to send out vampire assassins like Dio, but under different circumstances, and I don't think he'd be outright evil about it. For example, I honestly think he would send out vampire villains who go after Dio in particular, mainly Dio, mainly due to the fact that Dio ruined his life, so he wants to kill Dio, so by that logic, George I would send zombie vampire enemies out on Dio in particular. This obviously leads to Dio more or less kind of having to deal with all that all on his own. So that would generally just be my idea with it. That this could still lead to like Jack the Ripper or something. And maybe as the story goes on, we see maybe Jonathan about to get attacked, or Will, or Speedwagon, or something like that. And then Dio can come in and just save the group. Like maybe he takes a really brutal attack just so Dio can help get them the win at the end. Kind of showing Dio at a more less of that heartless kind of personality he had in the past. And now we're starting to see Dio become more and more nicer, more kind to people. And that's kind of where I would want to build him up to that point. We see him being more respectful, more humble, more caring. Someone who's willing to sacrifice himself as the story goes on. Definitely different from the same Dio who, in the beginning, ruined everyone's life. Now, I think if we're talking about main arcs, I don't really think in the case of George I, I don't think he would do everything Dio did in particular. Like, I don't think he'd go as far as to, let's say, hypnotize a woman to eat her own baby, like how Dio did. But I could see him probably doing some kind of screwed up crap, like getting more people turned into vampires, probably bringing in a lot of them, if anything, maybe even more, because he is a lot more vengeful. In the case of George I, his reasons aren't just pure evil. It's not like world domination. It's more of the fact that his humanity was robbed. So in his way, he's trying to get back for that loss of humanity that was taken away from him. In a way, he's more or less bitter about that. He lost everything. He lost the chance of living a normal life, being rich again. Everything was taken away. His humanity, his money, his house, all taken away because of Dio. So by this point, George I is more or less wanting revenge on Dio. That's more or less his goal. Jonathan's more or less helping Dio out, and in a way, Dio's becoming a better person, while George is just becoming bitter about it, which is how I would write the story. Now, when it comes to, I guess, other villains, I don't think we would get Tarkus back, and I don't think we'll get Buford back, or however you pronounce that guy's name. I don't think we'll get them, since I feel like, if I remember correctly, didn't Dio just bring them back from the dead? I don't think George I would do that. Now, I don't think George I would be a complete idiot like, let's say, the zombie from the vampire guy from the drunk old man guy who kills Dio in my one Dio What If. I don't think he's an idiot like him, and I do think George I would at least experiment on the stone mask more than him, since I do think he would have kept the mask like how Dio did. So I think George I would have at least known what he can and can't do. But I don't think he'd bring back Tarkus and the other guy, so I'm pretty much certain we just get new villains here instead. But I'm going to assume Jonathan and his team can win. In my opinion, I do think Will's going to die here, but probably dies to George I. Dyer maybe still dies, but I'm thinking he'll live. Maybe Dio's like, hey, don't go in and charge in like an idiot. You'll get yourself killed. And then Dio can pitch like an idea on how to beat George I. Now, in my opinion, I honestly think Jonathan and Dio would work together to score the final blow. And I think they would both destroy George I's body together. Straitso and Dyer can help out by going against George I's own minions or something, along with Speedwagon. And then at the end, we get kind of a happier ending for Phantom Blood. But however, in this timeline, Dio would go on the wedding ship with Jonathan and Irina, and George I would be the one crashing it with his head. So kind of like how Dio did. But instead of Jonathan, I would have Dio be the one who takes the place. So George I's head kills Dio, and this leads to Dio sacrificing himself. Maybe he goes after Jonathan, but his main target's Dio. And in a way, it's pretty ironic, because Dio was the one who did it in the canon, so now it's Dio who's doing it. And it also kind of comes full circle with Dio in a way. He starts off as unlikable and would just do anything it takes to ruin everyone's life, and now Dio's risking his life for the future of the Joestar family. Dio went from trying to ruin the Joestar family and take everything away to now taking away his own life so the Joestars can live another day. So Jonathan, Irina, Lisa, and the future George II can have that happy ending. Honestly, on a side note, Dio could also get married during this time skip and maybe find a new girl to have been with. So Rhina or my Dio Son OC can't exist, which he only was in like one video. So you know what, I'll add him in this one because why not? But yeah, that's how I would imagine it. Maybe Dio would find a girl during the time skip and have his own child, which is something I would personally include because why not? But at the end, it would kind of just be like that, and that's how I imagine Phantom Blood going. Now, in Battle Tendency, one change I gotta admit off the bat is that George II is going to be a different name. Okay, so George Joseph II still exists, and I feel like a lot of his personality traits and his characteristics exist, but the name is going to be different because I don't think Jonathan's going to name George II after his father who killed his brother and ruined his life and killed his mentor. Instead, I honestly get the feeling that George II would likely be renamed maybe to something Dio related. I think he maybe just be Dio Joestar, or maybe something Dio-like. Kind of in a way for, instead of it being a way to kind of like reference his father who died. Instead, in this timeline, since Dio was the one who went a heroic death, Jonathan would name him after his late brother who passed away, who sacrificed his life so him, Irina, Lisa, George II could live. And then Dio can honestly have his own wife and son as well, which I would bring along. Kind of a double wedding. So Jonathan and Dio got their own happy ending. Dio would have his son Rhina, and I'm going to assume Jonathan would kind of play the role of a father figure to Rhina to an extent, which is how I imagine it going. Rhino would not be evil in my opinion, and if he was, he'd just get killed. Now the question is, the zombie commander and George II thing, I guess it can still happen, but I don't know. Probably not. I don't know. It's kind of a tough one to say. I think Jonathan may help him out here, so yeah, I don't think he'll die here. Lisa could probably still leave off to train on Hamon. Obviously, Joseph still exists, and then this would lead to Andrea and Lato, the son and daughter of Rhina, so Dio's grandkids. And then we get those three in the parts. On a side note, I feel like Mario Zeppeli still dies, but I think Caesar's siblings could get involved because Dyer or Straitzo would take care of Caesar and his siblings after the death of Mario, so yeah. Mainly Dyer would probably be taking care of them since him and Will had a close relationship. Straitzo would never turn into a vampire since he's got more friends to be around him, so he's going to stay good for the rest of his time in this franchise. Now, when it comes to how the story would change in this alternative universe, when it comes to the beginning half, obviously there's no Straitzo fight. I do think that Andrea and Lato could be with Joseph in the beginning, but there would be no fight with Straitzo. Maybe some other villain can come in and fight them. I don't really know how it would go, but maybe Straitzo comes in and informs them everything going on. I'm going to assume for the sake of the plot, Rhina and George II can run in to try to stop Stroheim and the Nazis with Santana. This leads to Jonathan, and this leads to Dyer and Straitzo helping out as well, but them failing. Jonathan comes in, and it's Jonathan, Joseph, Andre, and Lato. And then they would work together and be able to try to save the day. I feel like for the rest of the story, I don't think much of Battle Tendency would really change. I think the whole thing with Santana would kind of just go the same. There's nothing I could really think of there. When it comes to the other stuff, obviously we still get to meet Caesar, but with his siblings around as well. And I don't think Caesar's siblings would get along with Caesar. I also don't think they'd get along with they might get along with Joseph. Andrea and Lato are... it's going to be hard to predict. I'm going to assume when it comes to age-wise, Caesar's siblings, obviously Caesar was canonically the oldest. Then the two brothers, which are twins, which I'm going to assume they're around the same age as Andrea. They're all 317, we'll assume. Then the other sister, we don't really know her age. I'm just going to assume for the sake of the plot, She's probably 15 during the events of Battle Tendency. Lotso is canonically around 13, and we'll say the youngest sister is around 13 as well. So the youngest sister and Lotso are around the same age, give or take. Which would probably be around the same age as Smokey during this point of the story as well. But Smokey's not here because I don't think since he canonically probably wouldn't be able to learn Hamon. Plus, even if he could, I don't think Jonathan would trust wanting to bring him along, since he seems like he wouldn't really be too good for the battle. When it comes to the rest of Part 2, I don't think much would honestly change. I feel like everything would kind of just go the same at that point. The Mark stuff goes the same, along with everything else kind of at that point. That's honestly all I could really see really happening. Mark still dies. Everything with the Pillarman generally just goes the same, so Joseph still gets the rings on him. The next part of the story that would honestly change is the introduction of Lisa, which would include more characters to be there. I do wonder how the training would go in this timeline. I could see Jonathan, George, and Rhina definitely taking in to train the others, or at least Rhina training his kids. I could see George II focusing more on Joseph's training. When it comes to Season, the siblings, I can maybe see being Machina, Loggins, Dyer, and Straitza working together on them, which is probably how I think it would go. Alternatively, it could go somewhere else. I could see George and Lisa again to interact again, which George would kind of be a little disappointed because Lisa would leave George to take care of the Pillarman stuff, but George probably wouldn't understand it till later on, which once he understands, he would understand why Lisa did that. I don't think Part 2 would honestly change up until here. Loggins probably could still die, but I don't really think much would change regardless. Personally, I don't think Machina and Loggins are going to be in Part 3. I know I'm not going to make a lot of people happy saying this, but we don't know much about their characters, so we don't really know what they could have done. But on a side note, I could say for the sake of the plot, maybe Loggins survives here, but like Machina, we don't know what happens with them, so they're both taken out of the story. When it comes to the rest of the story afterwards, Part 3, at least for the rest of Part 2, I don't think much would change. Whether Loggins lives or dies doesn't really matter here. When it comes to the Switzerland stuff, aka the stuff with Kars and Stroheim, I don't think nothing would honestly change here. Excuse me, burped. When it comes to the Wamu fight, though, oh my gosh, my throat is really dry. After I record this Part 2 half, I'm going to go and take a bit of a water break. Or I'm going to get some water, and then I'm going to record the rest of this video while drinking some water so my throat can heal up. Because talking too much is just killing my throat, and I haven't drank much all day. Yeah, sorry to take a bit of a break just to say that, but yeah. When it comes to the Wamu stuff in general, I still think Caesar's going to charge into battle, but I think that's Dyer and Straitzo. I was screwing up some names. My throat's just honestly killing me at that point where I'm trying to rush this. Dyer and Straitzo would help Caesar, or at least Dyer in particular, and I think Dyer can sacrifice himself so Caesar can live, and this can give Caesar enough time to kill Wamu. So Wamu's taken out much earlier in this timeline. Or maybe Caesar's siblings can help out, and I would like to see Caesar and his siblings work together to kill Wamu, as a way to redeem themselves for, I guess, everything that went on in their lives. So kind of giving the Zapellis at least somewhat of a happy ending. When it comes to the rest of Part 2, I don't think much would change, and when it comes to the Kars fight in particular, I don't think too much would change, except that I think Jonathan could probably just take Lisa's place here, in my opinion, but that's honestly all I could really see happening. Yeah, that's honestly all I could see happening. I think Jonathan could just take the place of Lisa against Kars, but that's just my opinion. I don't think much would change here in Battle Tendency, and we kind of just get the rest of the story going the same. Joseph loses his hand. Joseph dies to Kars, and then comes back. Everything in the canon just goes the same. I don't really think much would change. I don't really have much else to say on Battle Tendency, except that that's what I think would happen. Alright, so the next part we got to talk about is Stardust Crusaders. Now in this timeline, who's in the adventure? I'm going to say Jonathan, George II, Lisa, Caesar, Julius, Rose, Dominic, Nico, Stroheim, Rhina, Andre, and Andre's granddaughter, Alina, would all be in the story. Lotso is a maybe, but I don't think she'd be here, just in my opinion. I don't think... Obviously, this is a hot take for, I guess, a certain bit of my fan base, because I know a good chunk of these people love these two characters, but I don't see Machina and Loggins in the story, since we don't really know much about their characters after the events of Part 3, so... Or, I mean, after the events of Part 2, so... Yeah, I'm pretty much certain those two are just not here. When it comes to other characters, Straight So is a character I could potentially see, but I really don't know how to give him a stand in the story without it just coming out of nowhere or just not working, because I don't really know how it would work. But yeah, it would be hard to kind of right away to give Straight So a stand. Now, another question, I guess, is George the First being the main villain, because I'm gonna go with the assumption he's the main villain here. So obviously in this timeline, George I basically would play the Dio role. Now, I don't think he'd go for world domination per se, but I'm just going to assume that his motivation is now to kill Dio's remaining family along with the Joestars. Maybe George I feels betrayed that his son Jonathan picked to help Dio all those years ago. So this is going to be George I's new motivation. Let me get a water break. So George I has a new motivation in that he wants to kill every one of the Joestars and the Brandos because of his life being ruined. At this point, George I has been locked down in the casket for 90-something years like Dio. Now, I don't think George I don't know if he's going to get it on and have any illegitimate kids pulling a Dio or anything. So, we'll cross that bridge when we get to parts 5 and 6 in particular. But, yeah. We're not going to cross those. We're not going to cross that bridge in particular yet. But at the moment, regarding part 3, George I would have a motivation, and that would be to kill the Brandos and the Joestars. So at this point, George I, everything has basically ruined his life because of all the past events of Phantom Blood. You know, Dio putting the stone mask on him to try to kill him, causing the house fire to destroy the Joestar mansion and wealth. In other words, George I's life sucks. Everything was taken away that he loved: his humanity, his riches, his family, the love of his son, the son's love for him. All of it was taken away because of Dio. So George I holds a huge vendetta against Rhina and the rest of the lineage of the Brandos. He also holds a vendetta against Jonathan for what he did to him and helping Dio over him. And not only that, but holds a vendetta against the rest of the Joestars for it. And anyone who aids the Joestars and Brandos is an enemy to him. Basically like Dio to an extent in that way. But he would probably not really have a world-dominating threat level. The main motivations would be to save Holly and Andrea's daughter in 60 days or in 50 days because they're going to die to their sickness. You know, basically the same motivation as it was in the canon, but not really the whole world could end stakes that Dio was presenting us with. Now, in this timeline, when it comes to part 3, I honestly don't think much would honestly change in the beginning. I could definitely see there being different ways for everything to happen. Now, maybe George I can still pull off the flesh bug, so in this timeline, we could still get Kakyoin and Polnareff being drawn to George I, like how they were drawn to Dio. Assuming they have stands by this logic, I'm just going to assume for the sake of the plot that they might have stands. Which, if they do have stands in this timeline, I could see being one of those things where they end up just joining forces with George I for a bit, and then this leads to them attacking them. So I'm just assuming George I has a stand by this point. He meets Inya and then gets stabbed by the arrow. And I guess the question would be what his stand would be in this timeline. Now, I feel like he would have his own stand, but I could see it being another situation to Jonathan's Hermit Purple where he can control another stand. And in this timeline, I'm just going to assume he has the world. Kind of a lazy scenario, but then again, that is Dio's stand. So him owning Dio's body could give him the power of the world, along with his own stand. I don't know what it would be. Maybe it can help him out in some way against the others, but it can help him out with his usage of the world. So that would be George I. He can use his own weird, unique stand along with the world and time-stopping powers. So obviously he can still take down Kakyoin and Polnareff and get them to join his team. Obviously, Kakyoin and Polnareff would get flesh bugs put on them, and this leads to Jotaro removing them, as he does in canon. Obviously, we still have like Joseph, Jotaro, Kakyoin, Polnareff, and Avdol on the team, and eventually Iggy when he joins. I could see Whole Horse maybe joining, because with the extra girls on your team, you could definitely give Whole Horse an excuse to want to join because of him being nice to women. So it'd be nice to get my boy Whole Horse on the team. Now, when it comes to how the, I guess, ending half would go, I don't think any big changes would happen. Like, I could definitely go into big changes later, like all the arcs eventually, if you want to hear them in the comments, but I would honestly rather save that for like a comment discussion, not this video. Regarding the final half, when it comes to going against younger Darby, I would assume for the sake of the plot that obviously we still have Joseph, Jotaro, and Kakyoin being taken away, but obviously there'd be more characters who get taken away as well. I'm going to say, for my opinion, Julius, Rose, Dominic, and Nico, and Alina can be taken away. And those would be like my main characters I would just take away for this arc. Everyone else is going to be for the Vanilla Ice fight, so Jonathan, Rhina, Andrea, Andre, Caesar, Stroheim, Whole Horse if he's around, and Lisa if she's around as well. Those characters are potentially like here for the Vanilla Ice fight. So younger Darby I don't think is changing. Vanilla Ice though, I'm going with the assumption that nothing honestly would change here. I'm gonna assume Avdol still maybe gets killed, maybe. I don't know. If Whole Horse is around, he can take that death, or maybe Lisa can take that death. I don't know. I don't think too much would honestly change here. When it comes to this half of the story. When it comes to the final fight though against George I, I do think in the case of George I, he wouldn't have Dio's arrogance. I mean George I was cocky, at least to an extent. I always got the feeling that he had a bit of a cocky, narcissistic vibe to him, but I don't think he was a full-blown narcissist like how Dio was. So I don't think he would have done as much of an arrogant stuff as Dio did in the canon. Now, when it comes to, I guess, moments in the story, George I could potentially still do the whole moving someone down the steps thing, but I don't think it seems in character for him. In theory, he may just straight up kill someone on the steps if he's smarter. If he's a lot smarter than Dio, assuming Polnareff, maybe he's smarter in this timeline, he could just kill Polnareff while he's on the steps in this timeline, which would probably just be a smarter move for George I in general, if he wants to go that route. Assuming he doesn't, I don't really think much would change, and I'm going to assume he wouldn't. Now, when it comes to, I guess, revealing the world's power, I don't think it would be Kakyoin, and I think Caesar would do it in this timeline. So I would personally just have Caesar be the one who dies revealing the world's power, which I think would be a better send-off for his character. So I would just let Caesar die here. And when it comes to who else would die in the fight, I personally would have both Jonathan and Stroheim die in the final fight as well, but that's just my opinion. Stroheim can die. Actually, now I think about it, I don't know if George I would have absorbed any Joestar's blood. I'm just gonna assume he might not be able to, and if he does, he could absorb like Rhina's blood instead, or maybe Andre's blood or Alina's blood, and this could kind of give him a boost instead to kind of play that role instead. I think maybe Rhina can just take the place of Joseph, so maybe Rhina's the one with the fake out death and gets brought back to life. I don't know. That, or if Joseph still doesn't, I don't know if Joseph can get resurrected in this timeline without it being Joestar blood. I just realized that Joseph potentially could die in this timeline now that I think about it. Unless Jonathan could, like, sacrifice himself for Joseph to live. I am thinking Jonathan's dying here at the end of the day, though. I don't know if George I would be successful in, let's say, absorbing the blood of someone and becoming a high version of himself, like how Dio did. That much is honestly kind of hard to predict. I do think Stroheim is going to die in this timeline. Potentially, actually, now I think about it, I don't think he might die in this version. If George I can't turn into a greatest high version of himself like how Dio did. So Stroheim wouldn't die here like in a majority of my Part 3 timelines. He could set up the UV lights and actually potentially kill him. Or just to damage him enough, along with his son Dominic and his daughter Nico to help out and give Jotaro enough of an edge to kill George I here. I could see Jonathan dying here, honestly. That, or since Jonathan got killed at the end of the fight along with Rhina in my other Dio What If, I could see both surviving here, and instead I could actually see Joseph just dying instead. Since I don't know if we would get that whole thing there. Obviously, Jotaro could still do the whole heart thing, but I don't know. I think the blood transfusion was needed to do that, actually. So, for all we know, I could see Joseph just dying in this timeline, along with just having the entire story literally just change because of that. So I could actually see Joseph potentially just legit dying in this timeline, and I don't think much would change regardless, unfortunately. The only changes I guess would happen in this timeline are that Avdol, or maybe Whole Horse, I don't know. I'm going to say Whole Horse, maybe. Nah, I think Avdol, actually. I'll say in this timeline, maybe Whole Horse, and since Lisa, maybe we'll say Lisa's not in this timeline, or maybe she is, I don't know. If Lisa or Whole Horse are here, I could see Avdol living, but I don't know. One of those characters died of Vanilla Ice, though, it doesn't matter who. And then you obviously have Caesar dying, and then Joseph potentially dying, which I assume he might actually die. Assuming the blood transfusion played a part in his survival. The rest of Part 3 kind of just goes the same with who lives and dies, I guess, to an extent. Or at least with Jotaro and Polnar, if they still live like they did in the canon. Kakyo and Avdol and Iggy get to live in this timeline. Jonathan would get to live. George would get to live. Rhina, Andre, I think it's Andre, or Andrea. I think it's Andre, actually. Alina would get to live as well. Julius, Rose, Dominic, and Nico get to live, along with Stroheim. And I think those would probably just be the overall survivors. It's definitely an interesting surviving cast, and a weird one for sure. But I'm thinking that's going to be the surviving cast. Unless Jonathan just sacrificed himself for Joseph, or alternatively, maybe Jonathan gets killed in the fight still, but Jonathan and Joseph both get killed, which would make the Joestar deaths tragic. Honestly, Joseph dying might happen in this timeline, because I think the blood transfusion was what saved him at the end. I know, like, Jotaro had to beat his heart back into place, but I think that and the blood transfusion brought him back. It wasn't just the heart thing. I don't know if that solely alone would be able to bring Joseph back. If it can, then it would end with only Caesar and someone else dying to Vanilla Ice, whether it be Avdol or whether it be someone else. I don't know, but yeah, I think that's Part 3. Less death, I guess, to an extent. I don't know. It's hard to say. This one's a little tricky to write. Honestly, when it comes to writing around the whole Joseph thing, it sometimes gets a little tricky to write around that whole thing. But yeah, that's just my opinion on it. Now, regarding Part 4, I'm going with the assumption Joseph's dead. So, Josuke can still exist, but maybe under circumstances that they find out Jonathan or George II was the one who was able to reveal Josuke's identity and not Joseph. Joseph still exists since Josuke still exists since Joseph had him in like the early 1980s, so obviously that can still happen. Jotaro and Kakyon can go to Italy together to meet Josuke and Koichi, and that would just lead to them meeting Josuke and Koichi, and I honestly don't think much would change in the beginning. I don't honestly think much would change, because in this timeline, I honestly think Joseph is just downright replaceable. If anything, Joseph did nothing in Diamond is Unbreakable to an extent. I mean, his role, if you remove Joseph from DIU, in a timeline where you don't have anyone to replace him, like a Jonathan and George II to use Hermit Purple, you're really not missing out. There'd be some changes, but in a timeline like this, where there's characters who can honestly fulfill that role that Joseph played, you're not missing out on much. Honestly, when it comes down to it, since I'm still kind of debating, I'm just going to go with the assumption, maybe for the sake of the plot, Lisa and Whole Horse can be in the story, and we'll just say Lisa dies in Part 4, I guess. Or against Vanilla Ice. Poor George, he loses both a wife and his son in the story. Uh, I guess Lisa and Whole Horse can be here, and I'll just say Lisa dies to Vanilla Ice since I like Whole Horse more, and Avdol as well. So Avdol, Whole Horse can be in part 4. Nico can be in part 4 along with Rose. I think Lotso, Andrea, and Rhina and Alina can all be in part 4 as well. I don't think there'd be any extra Brando family members to add into part 4. I think only like parts 2, 3, and then spoiler alert for 6. Those are going to be the only parts we'll kind of get one for. But at the moment, I think that part 4 and 5 aren't going to be introducing any new characters for a little while, or at least part 4 won't. Part 5 I'll get to later because there's going to be a lot to discuss about for part 5, and also part 6 when we get to that point. But Dio's legacy here is, it's kind of hard to say, because for starters, Dio met Okuyasu and Keicho's dad, gave him a flesh bug, and then when Dio died, Okuyasu and Keicho's dad became a weird booger monster thing, and that led to Keicho wanting to give everyone stands in this timeline. So in this timeline, let's just assume George the First does it, which I'd say is the only logical choice. If there's no George the First to give him a flesh bug, and I guess this means Okuyasu and Keicho's dad is still alive, still a garbage father. That would mean a majority of the characters like Okuyasu and Rohan wouldn't get a stand. Koichi, I guess, might not get one, but then again, I could see Koichi getting one by other means, seeing how he was introduced really early in the story. I could see him eventually getting a stand by another way. Whether it be maybe Kira's dad giving him a stand on accident or on purpose, it's hard to say. But in this alternative timeline, when it comes to the rest of JoJo Part 4, I really don't know what else can honestly change here. Obviously, you have all these extra characters here to help out in Diamond is Unbreakable, so there would be a lot more changes on how the fights play out, how the characters interact, etc. I guess a question now would be what happens to Shizuka, since I'm pretty sure a lot of people would wonder that. When it comes to Shizuka's fate, I assume Jonathan or George II can discover her. I guess another question is, I think a lot of my George II fans would realize that in this timeline, normally George II would die in part 4. But I don't think he's going to be the one dying here, because I think Jonathan could take that place. So I actually think Jonathan would be the one who dies against Kira in the final fight of part 4 in this timeline. I think he can help out Josuke, and he would sacrifice himself in the final fight of part 4 so that Josuke can kill Kira. So I actually like to think that that would be how it goes out, which I honestly think would be a pretty cool way for Jonathan to go out. He helps Josuke so that he can kill Kira. So Jotaro doesn't, kill Kira, steal from Josuke, which I honestly kind of would have liked to seen. And plus we get a cool interaction between Jonathan and Josuke, which I think is cool. I don't really got much else to say on part 4. I think when it comes to who lives and dies, I honestly think everyone who originally lives and dies would still live and die. But, yeah. I don't have much else to say on part 4 in this timeline, except that we have so many more characters, and I think a lot of them would just survive in general. The only character who I think that would be a new addition to this team that would die is Jonathan. And the idea that Jonathan gets to live for, over 130 years and then just dies is kind of wild. So, yeah, that's just a little something that I just realized that's kind of funny to me. Not only that, but he gets to outlive characters like Shigechi. That is just crazy, man. But, yeah, that's in part 4 in this timeline. So, yeah, that's part 4. I think everyone else would survive, though, but that's just my opinion. Now, the next question we got to talk about is what happens in part 5. Oh, boy, part 5 is going to change a lot. So, in this timeline, for part 5, Giorno would not exist, because there's no Dio to have him, and I also don't get the feeling that George I is just going to pull a Dio and just have a bunch of one-night stands. I don't know. George I is a scumbag, would be a scumbag by this point in the timeline, because at this point he's just completely vengeful, but I don't think he's the kind of guy who's just going to have a bunch of kids and a bunch of one-night stands. Granted, his motivations could change. Maybe he becomes more psychotic to a point where he wants to have his own kids or something, or maybe he has his own child just as a way to, I guess, breed his own army because he wants to give himself the child he wished he could have or something. Probably maybe he creates a child just because something like as a successor, I guess, like a last resort thing. I don't know. I'm assuming he's not the kind of guy to have kids. But yeah, part 5 is not going to be looking too good in this timeline. So yeah, because we're not going to have a part 5 realistically, unless you're gonna reuse like Frodo for to play that journal role. Maybe in this timeline they can send Avdol and the Moria Warriors to investigate Frodo, and that leads to Frodo meeting Team Bucciarati. And I guess the story can take place from the perspective of Frodo and him joining and him becoming the boss. I don't know if he would. I mean, he'd probably become the boss. Let's be honest. He seems like he's the kind of guy who'd want to get some extra money. Frodo's an OC. If no one gets what I'm talking about. Polnareff wouldn't be alone because he's got Dominic, Nico. I mean, not Nico, but Dominic, Julius, Stroheim, Iggy. Just those characters. When it comes to part 5, this would be a really weird timeline because there's a lot of characters in this timeline, or at least a lot of characters who'd be stuck together, or at least Caesar's brothers would also be here as well. So you have those 6 characters together. Also, I forgot to mention Caesar's sisters would also be in part 4, but I think Caesar's sisters are in part 4 and Caesar's brothers are in part 5. Caesar's already dead, so he can't show up in any of those parts. When it comes down to it, I would personally have... it would be honestly hard because by this point, those characters are now stuck in Italy because there's no way to get them back in the story because there's no way to beat Diavolo. Unless Frodo just plays that Giorno role and then he has to be the one who has to stop him, which is a possibility. That or George I does pull a Dio and has a bunch of children or an illegitimate child, which if he does... that's going to be an interesting plot, and that would really need us to be creative and need to think of a new JoJo to create this world out of, or at least kind of craft in a new storyline out of a new JoJo. So in this timeline, I don't really have any ideas on how Part 5 can go and what it can change. That's honestly my entire ideas on Part 5. It would definitely be a different part as a whole and a different story. But I'm going to have to really think about how Part 5 would look in this timeline, though. Alright, it is time to get into Stone Ocean. Time to end off the storyline. Alright, so the first question is, Poochie. Yeah, so what Poochie does. Okay, now in this timeline, unlike the idea of Dio or George I having a bunch of illegitimate kids seeming out of character, George I talking Poochie into helping him eliminate the Joestar family and become a successor, that doesn't seem out of character. If anything, it seems more in character, especially if you have other context to add to this storyline, and the fact that, if you want to believe in this, which I think this was true, but I don't think it's really the truth, that Dio valued Poochie to an extent similar to how he's seen Jonathan. Or at least how he respected Jonathan, he's seen Poochie in that extent. Someone who is pure, someone who is very good-hearted to an extent, or at least before, the clan incident. In the case of George I, I actually could see that similarity being seen here. To him, he could see Poochie as someone similar to his son. Maybe he brings up something like, "You remind me a lot of my son." Poochie's not really knowing what to do. He's confused. And for the sake of the plot, we'll say George I can do everything that Dio did here. He goes to Poochie. He tells him how he reminds him of his son. He says a bunch of good stuff. Maybe says the whole "do you believe in gravity" thing. Can fix Poochie's foot like how Dio did. And that leads to Poochie honestly just kind of, idolizing George I to an extent, I guess. I don't know about idolizing, but maybe seeing him more as a father figure, I guess. I could see George I trying to talk Poochie into being his own son to an extent and kind of brainwashing him into believing that he's like the father figure for him and trying to give him all this kind of fatherly advice and trying to train him how to kill the Joestar lineage. This could lead to George could potentially getting to a point where we can still get the whole weather report and Perla stuff Perla still dies. Weather Report is almost killed by the clan, and this leads to Pucci awakening a stand Whitesnake, and then Weather Report can awaken Weather Report. Now the question is, will George I have the idea for the Heaven Plan? Honestly, we don't even know how Dio originally got that idea in the canon, so I guess maybe George I has that idea to obtain heaven. I don't really. Honestly, if anything, it really kind of goes against his motivation as a character. I don't know how we get the whole heaven idea in this timeline. I guess George could still have the idea, but maybe under a different reason. Maybe his okay. Thinking of it from the context of George I, of his reasons for being evil in Phantom Blood and Stardust Crusaders, and then we're gonna give it to context of what Dio's motivation was in Part 6. Okay, so kind of a run back on Part 6 Dio. He wanted to obtain heaven so everyone can know their future because he wanted them to know, I guess, the predetermined destiny. And in a way, it's kind of connected to the fact of Dio's egotistical god complex of him being above everyone and having everyone submit to that logic. George I's entire motivation from Parts 1 and 3 are pretty simple. In Part 1, he wants revenge on Dio for taking away his humanity and ruining his life. You know, taking away his humanity, burning his house down, including all of his money, and causing Jonathan to side with him instead. With Dio instead. So, yeah. By Part 3, in an extent, it's kind of a similar one, where he wants revenge on the entire Brando and Joestar lineage. You know, years of being stuck in a coffin, years of just feeling completely ashamed at the fact that he's, him being driven to insanity, at the fact that he could never, that the Brando lineage can still basically live on and coexist with the Joestar lineage, causes him to a point where he wants to eliminate them all, especially the Brandos. This causes him to a point where he would need to meet Pucci and would kind of try to share that ideology with Pucci. Now, how can the whole wanting to see the fated wanting to have everyone see their fate work into the extent of I want to wipe out the entire Joestar and Brando lineage because they ruined my life kind of motivation? Well, it really can't work to an extent. I mean, to be fair, Dio kind of had a similar motivation of, oh, I felt like I deserved better than the Joestars. And to an extent, George I is like, I felt like I deserved better, but Dio screwed me over. I guess to an extent you can argue that works. But another thing is that Dio wanted to rule the world. Unless during the times George I was stuck in the casket, George I realized that he had the powers to rule the world. Unless George I grew an ego and a god complex that similar to Dio that he would want to rule the world, I really don't think we really are going to have the heaven plan here. Is there any ideas we can use? I mean, the fact that Dio canonically has the Beetle Arrow, it's possible George I could give Pucci the Beetle Arrow in this timeline. This could lead to Part 6 turning more into a Requiem-style storyline. Honestly, now on a side note that I think about it, in theory, the Part 5 crew altogether could just solo Diavolo with the Requiem Arrow alternatively, but I'm just going to assume they don't. It sucks to say this, but I'm just going to assume the Part 5 crew are just... the Polnareff and his crew are just stuck in Italy for the rest of their life because they can't surpass Diavolo. If you want me to, I can explore more of the whole thing of Italy in the later part of a timeline for this, but that's just my idea for it. When it comes to Part 6 as a whole, Pucci's motivations are definitely going to be changed now that I'm starting to think about it. His reasonings for wanting to eliminate the Joestar family, along with the Brandos and every one of their allies, a lot of the complexity is going to be removed from that motivation of, I mean, obviously the whole wanting to avenge thing, but a lot of it kind of is a lot more simpler in this timeline of, I was taught that way by a great wise man, and then rather than to obtain heaven and give everyone peace in the universe. It's kind of one of those things where Pucci's motivation is definitely going to be less complex and a lot less grand for a character like him. I mean, it would definitely ruin his character for a lot of people. I would say to an extent it would kind of ruin him, but then again, maybe we don't get as many boring monologues from him because honestly, he kind of comes off as boring in a lot of the story, if I just gotta be honest. I honestly still think we can get Part 6 out of it to an extent. We just get a less complex Pucci. Honestly, the question is, what would the fight look like? I mean, Pucci could still take away Joestar's Stand memories, but his reasons for wanting Joestar's Stand memories are going to be more confusing. It leaves a lot more answers and questions. Maybe if anything, he's more interested in keeping Star Platinum around to want to obtain that power. Maybe because George the First had a similar power to Jotaro to an extent because he took Dio's body and obtained the world. Maybe he wants Star Platinum the world, and maybe that's part of the motivation. Maybe he wants to own his own version of Time Stop to put an end to the others, but Pucci maybe can't control it, so maybe the story is about Pucci looking for a new successor for the world, or someone he can build up to it. Obviously, you can't go with the assumption George the First has any kids, unless maybe George the First does pull a Dio and has a bunch of kids, and then the story can maybe just be Pucci looking through these kids and seeing, well, who's worthy enough to control this stand, which is honestly a scenario that I actually could think of that could potentially be an interesting case scenario. I don't really think that I can really think of much to come out of this timeline. Okay, this is definitely a tough timeline to really think about, man. I don't know. Well, I guess we still get a lot of the prison fights, or at least we can get a good chunk of the prison arcs in the story. There'd be a lot of rewriting, and definitely gonna have to find a way to do a lot of parts of the story. Obviously, you have to rewrite a lot of Pucci, honestly. That's the thing when it comes to Part 6. I still think Part 6 can happen. I feel like Pucci can be manipulated by George the First in Dio's place. It realistically could fit in the story. In my opinion, I can see that happening. But Pucci's motivations would have to be different. Likely to want to be more, I guess, simple. Something like eliminating the Joestar family because they killed George the First, who was, I guess, like a father figure or a grandfather figure to him, who gave him a lot of advice, I guess, to an extent. And that's what Pucci's motivation is, that I got all this advice from him, and that the Joestars had taken him away, and he had a hatred for the Joestars, and especially the Brando lineage, so in his words, Pucci wants to take them all down by himself, along with help. I think there's going to have to be a lot of rewriting, because honestly, Pucci just feels very boring in this timeline. He feels even more boring in this timeline than the canon. And I don't hate Pucci. I'm just saying Pucci's cool, but at the same time, I have some complaints that sometimes he just comes off as boring in the story. If you have a way to rewrite Pucci to make him interesting in this timeline, let me know in the comments, because I could probably use that if you want to extend this timeline in a comment section, because a decent bit of my timelines get extended that way, and it actually helps them out a lot, so yeah. This was something. I don't really got much to say on this timeline. The Part 6 and Part 5 half in particular are the ones that kind of screw me over. I obviously think we'll have a lot of characters to help out in this timeline. I feel like we'll have a lot of return characters and a lot of new characters here. I'd probably go into more detail about them in the comments, because this timeline is definitely hard to predict. Honestly, I might need to update this Part 6 timeline and Part 5 timeline eventually if I have a clear enough timeline. Maybe as a community post. Who knows? This timeline is definitely a more interesting one. And that's honestly all I really have for it. It was an interesting video, don't get me wrong. But Parts 5 and 6 are definitely confusing to write around, especially 5. I think Parts 1 through 4 I can easily write around a lot of motivations and a lot of kind of give off simple reasons on why something happens. But when it comes to Parts 5 and 6, it's like, you really can't do a lot, because there's a lot of things that Dio played a part in that I don't think George I would theoretically play parts in. So that's honestly all I really got for Part 6 here. And that's honestly all I have for the timeline. I thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I especially hope you enjoy it, Muhammad07. If you have any other requests, if anyone has any requests in the comments below, tell me in the comments. I'm willing to try to cover those requests. That's all I really have for the video. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next video. Goodbye.